Hi, my name is Rob Knight, and welcome to Photography Basic Skills. This is the fourth video in my series about the basics of exposure. So far we've learned that the exposure is controlled by what we call the exposure triangle. The ISO, aperture, and shutter speed settings combine to determine how bright or dark the image is in your camera. We learned that the ISO setting basically determines how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. Then we learned that the aperture setting determines how much light comes in through the lens. And we learned that this setting is our main control for the depth of field, or how much of your image is in sharp focus from front to back. If you need to catch up on these other settings, be sure to check out the 3 previous videos in this series. Today we're going to talk about the third point of the exposure triangle, which is the shutter speed. The shutter in your camera is a physical curtain that actually opens and closes to determine how much light strikes the camera's sensor during the exposure. The shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second, although your camera will probably only show you the denominator of that fraction. In other words, a 60th of a second will be displayed in the camera as simply the number 60. A smaller shutter speed number will let in more light than a larger number, just like f-stops that are also measured in fractions. For example, a 30th of a second is a longer period of time than a 1,000th of a second, so it would let in more light and therefore give you a brighter image. We can use the shutter speed to make the image brighter or darker, but it's important to understand that the shutter speed controls how motion is depicted in your image. A moving subject will appear blurry with a slow shutter speed, while a fast shutter speed can freeze a moving subject. Using a faster shutter speed when you're hand-holding the camera can also help eliminate blurry images from camera shake. A general rule is if your shutter speed is lower than your focal length, then it's a good idea to use a tripod. Although with today's image stabilized cameras and lenses, that rule can definitely be adjusted in practice based on your own camera and the availability of that IS. It's important to use as fast a shutter speed as possible when you're using longer focal length telephoto lenses. The longer the lens, the more pronounced the effects of camera shake tend to be. When you're shooting wildlife or sports or other fast moving subjects, you'll definitely want to keep the shutter speed as fast as possible. And in order to use that fast shutter speed, you'll probably need to adjust the other points of the exposure triangle to accommodate that. That may mean opening up the aperture to allow the most light into the exposure, or raising the ISO to make the sensor more sensitive, but most likely a combination of those two. You may want to use a slow shutter speed for creative effect. Some typical examples of slow shutter speeds would be capturing the silky look of a waterfall, or using a slow shutter speed to blur the lights of passing cars in a cityscape. Using a slow shutter speed in bright light can be a real challenge. You'll want to set your ISO as low as it will go, and you'll usually want to stop down the lens to a small aperture so that you can use that slow shutter speed. Sometimes even these settings are not enough, and you may need to use filters in front of the lens to allow you to use that slow shutter speed in bright light, but we'll talk about things like neutral density filters in another video. I wanted to show you some examples of different shutter speeds and how they affect motion in your pictures. And I'm going to start at kind of the extreme slow end, and this is a 13-second exposure. I used a filter in this case, I believe a polarizing filter, to limit the light coming into the camera so I could shoot for 13 seconds. And what that does is blur that water and make it really silky smooth for artistic effect. But you'll notice that the still subjects like the rocks are all perfectly sharp and still because the camera is locked down on a tripod. We're going to move up to a 1-second exposure. And again, the still subjects are perfectly sharp because I'm on a tripod, but the moving subjects, in this case the people, are blurry in the image because the shutter is open for a whole second. Now you may use a 1-second exposure or even longer, even for a still subject, even if you don't want to show motion, like this shot from Grand Teton National Park. That's just because it was low light level. So I needed that long exposure, in this case a whole second, to get enough light into the picture to make the exposure that I wanted. We're going to move up to about a half of a second now. And this is actually in the Olympus cameras using a feature called Live ND. So it's a half a second exposure that I can hand hold because of the image stabilization in my camera.
If you don't have good image stabilization and you're shooting at these longer shutter speeds, like a 1 second or a half of a second, then you're going to want to use a tripod for sure. But I love the way that this combines the silky movement of the water with the still subject and my friend Eric here. And that contrast, I think, is a really nice artistic addition to the photograph. You might want to use a half a second exposure for something like clouds, or in this case, lightning, because it gives you that blurred, again, sort of an artistic effect. So it's important to understand how the shutter speed is going to affect how the moving subjects in your image appear. Moving to 1/10 of a second. Again, this is a handheld shot, but if you don't have an image stabilized lens or an image stabilized camera, you might want to use a tripod if you're shooting at 1/10 of a second. And this is a much less extreme blurring, but I do like the way that the rain in the distance in the valley there still has that sort of blurred effect. It's not just still and sharp. This is an example of how you might use a slower shutter speed than you would think, depending on the environment. This is a 1/30th of a second, and it seems like a really bright image, but these owls are actually under the jungle canopy, so they're kind of in the dark. This is with the higher ISO setting, and I still needed to shoot at a 1/30th of a second just to get the exposure that I wanted. So in this case, I used a slower shutter speed not to show motion, but simply to get enough light into my image. Now I've moved up here to 125th of a second, which seems kind of fast, and it's certainly enough to freeze this cardinal in motion, and he's nice and tack sharp. But you'll notice behind him, you can see the rain falling, and that's still making streaks in the image. So even at 125th of a second, I'm still getting a little bit of motion blur in the parts of my image that are moving faster. Now we bumped up to 1/250th of a second. And this is kind of a good middle of the road shutter speed for a lot of things. It can freeze some slight motion. In this case, the monkey here, he's nice and sharp and still. Now, if he was jumping around too much, we would get a little motion blur, but 2/50th is when we're going to really start to freeze motion. And like this guy, this was at 250th of a second. So he was moving around a little bit, moving his head and that kind of thing. That 2/50th of a second was enough to freeze the motion and get a nice tack sharp shot. Now this frame here is at 500th of a second, and there's a little bit of motion that you might not notice at first in her cape. The model is swinging her cape around, and that 500th of a second was enough to freeze the motion of that and get a nice still tack sharp image while still getting the exposure that I wanted and sort of limiting that light. This is a nice bright sunset light coming over the mountains. And at 500th of a second, I was able to freeze the motion of the model and get the exposure that I wanted. Now we've moved up to 1250th of a second. This is what I would consider the minimum for photographing birds in flight. But you can see this photograph of this hawk that even his wingtips are still a little bit blurred. We've still not locked him down. But again, his eyes tack sharp, his body that's not moving is nice and tack sharp, but his wingtips where his feathers are still moving haven't been quite frozen yet. This is another shot at 1250th of a second where the gull in the middle of the frame, that's where my focus point was, he's nice and tack sharp. The other gulls in this case are out of focus because of the depth of field, which is limited because I'm using a telephoto lens and I'm using it wide open. Now we've bumped up to a 4,000th of a second. And you can see that this freezes the elk completely. They're running along and they're still frozen and tack sharp. And you need a lot of light for these really fast shutter speeds. In this case, I'm shooting in broad daylight at ISO 1600 in order to get enough light in so I can use these faster shutter speeds and really freeze the action. And the same with this shot. This Caracara is tack sharp, frozen in place at 4,000th of a second because we have plenty of light. He's up in the sky, and I can completely freeze the bird in flight.
Well, hopefully that helps you understand the basics of exposure. Once you understand how to control exposure using the exposure triangle in your camera, you can start to make creative decisions about how you want to capture your images. All the other bells and whistles and settings and features in your camera depend on having a good exposure to start with. So practice and get these 3 settings dialed in before you worry about the other fancy stuff. Please feel free to add questions in the comments below and subscribe to this channel for more photography tutorials. I really appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.